The great program and posters that have been up everywhere were designed by Allie and husband. I'm sorry, husband, I don't know first name. Jeremy. We are so grateful. It was such a cool design, and we've gotten lots of great comments about it. So thanks to the two of you for designing those this semester. And then Andrea Christensen, we're always so grateful for. She's our visual resources person here at the university. And let me tell you, this would never come off if it weren't for Andrea. So we're incredibly grateful for her also. And we're so grateful for the students. They are a delight, and we are just going to go in the order of the program. That's why I wanted to make sure you all had a program. I won't get up in between any of them. The title slide of their presentation will be at the beginning of each one of their presentations, so you can get their name and the title of their presentation. So we wish them the best of luck, and we'll go ahead and start with Eva.
It has been argued that gender was contested and manipulated in predictable ways throughout ancient Mesoamerican civilizations. However, the symbolic components of the process of weaving evidence that power assigned to each gender was distributed equally among men and women in their dualistic theology. Though anciently, weaving may have been encouraged for the female gender in attempts to advance the society economically, weaving is nevertheless an empowering act that, for Maya women, consecrates them with their divine calling as creators, intercessors between generations, and intercessors between human and the divine. Furthermore, the spider, nature's weaver, serves as an informative symbol that illuminates the sanctity of weaving and contextualizes the power that the woven huipil imbues when worn by women. Still, there is little scholarship that extensively analyzes the relationship between Maya women and spiders. I contend that in order to fully understand the power that women possess while weaving and while wearing the huipil, we must critically examine the spider's divine attributes. In various indigenous cultures, spiders are associated with female rule, nocturnal dominion, war, birth, earth, and the underworld. Furthermore, the association between spiders and female deities throughout Mesoamerican civilizations appears to be a strong and persistent occurrence. The Aztec great goddess of Teotihuacan exhibited many spider-like characteristics. As depicted in the Tepantitla compound mural, the great goddess of Teotihuacan is framed by a tree whose trunk hosts a colony of creeping spiders. Detailed in the center of the mural, one particular spider suspends herself from the tree by emitting thread from her abdomen. She hangs directly above the great goddess's head as to convince the viewer that it is she, the spider, who grants her characteristics and powers to the great goddess. In the same arachnid fashion, Maya women suspend themselves from a tree when they attach the backstrap loom around their own waist and then around the trunk of the tree. By doing so, the loom connects the woman to the tree in the same manner that a web connects a spider to a tree. Not coincidentally, this purposeful replication of a process occurring in nature transforms the weaving woman into the divine and powerful spider. Once she becomes the spider, she possesses the ability to manipulate thread and weave intricate designs. Through weaving, both the spider and the woman fulfill a duty that is inherent to their existence. Nevertheless, the relationship between spiders and weavers goes beyond the work that they perform. In Mesoamerican cultures, fertility and the power to create life is associated with spiders. Like the Aztecs who worship the great goddess of Teotihuacan, the indigenous people of the North American Southwest revere their spider grandmother. Spider grandmother is a prominent figure among several southwestern tribes, such as the Navajo and Maricopa. Yet her greatest influence and reverence is observed amongst the Pueblo tribe, for she plays a central role in their creation story. Though she is not regarded as a goddess per se, her power and influence compares in a parallel manner insomuch that she is regarded as a type of creator goddess. The Hopi tribe compares her to Huruwinguti, who is the goddess of everything. Moreover, they state that Spider Grandmother and Huruwinguti are both names for Mother Earth. They are synonymous. For this reason, it is no surprise that Spider Grandmother is associated with the abundant, fertile earth. Additionally, she is also associated with the underworld and is believed by the Hopi to bring people out from its death. She acts as an intercessor between life and death, facilitating what the Maya call a second birth. As evidenced by these Mesoamerican goddesses, spiders evoke more connections than just weaving. They are associated with female power, nocturnal rule, war, birth, earth, and the underworld. Therefore, like the Maya goddess Ixchel, depicted in Haina figurine of woman weaving on backstrap loom, spiders are also associated with all that the Mesoamericans believe to be inherently female, especially weaving as it relates to the divine act of creation and birth. It is important to also emphasize that like the weaving spider that embodies these various female elements, when a woman weaves, she embodies the various female powers associated with each shell and the spider. When the woman weaves, she becomes the spider and the goddess. She gains dominion over all things female. A central characteristic of the aforementioned deities associated with spiders and weaving is their role as grandmothers. In the Yucatec text, Ritual of the Bacabs, each shell is referred to as grandmother. The sacred Quiche text, the Popol Vuh, also attests to the strength and power of the grandparent role. In this Maya creation story, it is grandmother Shmukane who creates the world and creates human flesh from ground-up maize. For the Hopi, it is grandmother spider who is responsible for the creation of the four worlds. These indigenous creation stories recount the primary involvement of a mighty grandmother figure in the creation of the world and the creation of humankind. It is grandmothers who embody essential female attributes. Weaving seamlessly reenacts the relationship between grandparent and grandchild. When the weaver connects the loom from her waist to the tree trunk, she reattaches herself to the mother tree, who is a subsequent of the life-generating world tree. The loom, which mimics a spider's thread, also becomes an umbilical cord, connecting the weaver to the source of life. In this relationship, the mother tree becomes the grandparent, the weaver the mother, and the weaver's creation, the huipil, is the child. Thus, the most meaningful relationship in Maya theology, that of grandparent to grandchild, is realized through the mother tree and the huipil. The huipil then is not just a textile, but it is the divine offspring of the mother tree or the world tree. It is the first creation. Through this relationship, the huipil contains divine origin. It is an ancestral cloth. The Maya say that when they wear it, it puts them in the form of the ancestors. The most important and powerful textile that a woman can weave or wear is the huipil. The ceremonial huipil from the Santa Maria Magdalena area can be visually described as a white tunic with red geometric designs covering the chest, back, and sleeves. The garment as a whole represents the four cardinal directions. The pattern on the chest represents the south, the back represents the north, the right shoulder represents the east, and the left shoulder represents the west. When a woman dresses in the ceremonial garment, she puts her head through the center opening and stretches her arms through the side slits. Through this process, she actively becomes the center of the universe. Thus, the routine act of dressing becomes a powerful action as the Maya woman claims her place in the universe. Throughout the Magdalena huipil, symbols referencing woman and spider's fertility are present. Motifs such as rain and maize imbue the woman with life-giving force. However, because the Maya believe in the beauty of life and death as an interwoven cycle, the presence of death is also vital on the woman's huipil. Throughout the huipil, images of sopilotes, worms, and bats can be seen. The sopilote is a black vulture predominantly seen throughout Mexico and other parts of Central America. The vulture represents death, as it is the fowl that feeds on the deceased carcasses of animals and humans. Similarly, worms aid in the decomposition of bodies buried in the ground. To further represent death, like spiders, bats primarily reside in caves, which are openings into the underworld, into Xibalba. When a Maya enters a cave, he or she is literally entering Xibalba. As such, caves are sacred to the Maya. Spiders in various Mesoamerican cultures are associated with the underworld, and likewise, caves. Though spiders have predominantly been referred to as fertile because of their ability to lay up to 1,000 eggs at a time, and have been referenced as bearing life-giving powers because of their association with crawling up onto trees, it is when spiders are placed in the context of the cave that they can represent death, and therefore Xibalba. Similarly, the Maya classic goddess Ai has domain over both complementary opposites. She is the goddess of life and birth, yet she also has dominion over death and Xibalba as the wife of god El. The dualistic nature of the spider and her power over the complementary opposites is transferred to the woman when she puts on the huipil. The woman then simultaneously becomes the creator of life and the guardian of death, granting her ultimate power over a full life and death cycle. As has been shown, both the process of weaving and the use of the huipil grant women the power to create, to act as intercessors for the ancestors and for the gods, and grants them complete power over a cycle of complementary opposites. Because the spider stands as a symbol for the aforementioned powers, the association between woman and spider is critical in understanding Maya women's role in their society. Thank you.
Throughout history, a ring has been a sort of promise. A wedding ring has been a symbol of a vow between two individuals since the ancient Egyptians. Since at least the 7th century, the clergy has worn rings both to symbolize their marriage to the church and to provide them with a certain status. The signet ring dates back to the Egyptians as well, providing an iconic seal for their documents in order to verify authenticity. These rings, all rings, have a certain symbolism that surrounds them. The circle with no end is well known to be a symbol for eternity, and the gift of the ring is renowned even today. In the instance of the arm reliquary of St. Blaise, this symbolism remains. For upwards of 500 years, the bishops of the Brunswick Cathedral would place a ring at the beginning of their tenure. Each ring a symbol for a promise and a representation of a vow made between the patron and saint in order to further bless the people. The arm reliquary of St. Blaise is now the oldest surviving arm reliquary. The arm bone of St. Blaise in a wooden core gilt with what is said to be silver but looks like gold. With hammered skin and a narrowed sleeve, it has a tactile feel that invites people to interact with it, differing from many other reliquaries. The resting hand has 16 rings of all eras and styles stacked all the way to the top, including posy rings, a bishop's ring, and a stirrup ring, among others. Commissioned in 1040 by Countess Gertrude, it resided in the Brunswick Cathedral up until the 19th century. Attributed to St. Blaise, an Armenian bishop and physician from the 4th century, after living for years in isolation, he was imprisoned, skinned, and finally beheaded. During his life, his ministry contained many miracles. He commanded a wolf to leave an old woman's pig alive, and he saved a little boy from choking on a fishbone. The rings were placed on the reliquary between its creation in 1040 up until the mid-16th century. While there are many styles that range through the ages, providing a timeline of devotion, from the tarp mold ring that was likely 13th century to the 16th century belt ring that rests atop the middle finger. Some, such as the bishop's ring and the posies, show deeper meaning. The arm reliquary of St. Blaise is unique. With unusually textured skin, it is thought by Joseph Salvatore Ackley that the shiny purity of most reliquaries goes beyond the purity of the skin. It separates that reliquary from the people. This textured skin makes the reliquary approachable. It invites its patrons to interact with it. Perhaps it is because of this approachable nature that it was changed so much over the years. Each ring changes the power of the reliquary. Adding rings changes the worship of the reliquary. Not meant just to be used as a blessing hand or as extra prayers on behalf of the patrons, each bishop chose a way to participate. Each separate ring is a symbol of each separate promise. Where the signet ring is the sharing of identity, the posy rings are a promise of fidelity and an exchange of property, the physical for the spiritual. Each ring would have had to have been pulled from the finger of the man who owned it, a sort of skinning that would have been indicative of the sacrifice made by Blaise himself. To give up one's rings, to place them on the reliquary, it is a sacrifice. One intended to make a vow. Even with rings that are not signet rings, it was like signing their name. To place the ring there on the hand, it would be like declaring loyalty. It is because of this that we can assume that it would have been priests who have performed the act. When given control of the church to house the reliquary, they might place their ring, thus declaring loyalty both to the church and to the saint. Perhaps it was believed that to declare such specific loyalty would strengthen the bond between the saint and the surrounding area. After all, what could show more devotion than that? There is a special power that comes with rings. They are symbols of promise, a promise between two people to love and protect each other forever, a bond that encircles the bearer as a constant reminder of the vows that were made. This is the kind of bond that bishops made with St. Blaise, similar to their vow to God and the church. They have proclaimed fidelity. They have said essentially what is mine is yours, and if that does go both ways, then they are doing the work of St. Blaise in their lives every day. Rings adorn hands. Where earrings and ears are somewhat static, as are necklaces and necks, the hands are an active force. In the legends of St. Foix, she appears to her constituents in their dreams and demands their jewels, but her greatest request is rings. There has to be a reason. A hand is active, it gives blessings, it heals the sick, and it takes care of the poor. It is because of this that a ring has great power, beyond its traditional symbolism. Due to this unique trait, the centuries of bishops that served at the Brunswick Cathedral may have been asking something more of St. Blaise than his blessings on their town. In 1349, the Black Plague hit Brunswick. It became a center for Protestant revolts. In moments like this, the normal blessings would not be enough, as they were meant to be more helpful after death. First and foremost, the bishop's ring that is placed on the thumb looks to have an engraving on the stone which could make it a signet ring. That ring is a signature. It is like the Social Security card of the Middle Ages. In fact, when a pope dies, his ring is defaced to prevent it from being used for nefarious purposes. To place a ring like this on the reliquary is incredible. It is essentially signing the reliquary, like signing a contract. Maybe it was a desperate time, perhaps it was placed in years of sickness when an exceptional vow needed to be made. With St. Blaise's history as a physician and the healing myths that surround him, this could have been a bond meant to heal those sick and dying souls. The signet ring could also mean so much more. The signing of the reliquary could be the giving of the bishop's identity to the saint. Imagine, if giving a ring to someone is a bond, then making that bond signified with a signet ring would increase it tenfold. The Bible even discusses the gift of a signet ring. In Genesis chapter 38, Judah asks what pledge he should give to a harlot. She asked for his signet, like that was the greatest promise that he could give. The gift of a signet ring, the gift of identity, is far beyond the average vow. What is truly incredible is that there is only one. It was not tradition for the priest to place a signet ring. Whoever it was that gave this had the intent of bonding with St. Blaise in a way that had not been done before and has not been done since. Also on the reliquary are multiple posy rings, which were traditionally wedding rings. They were named due to the poem that was inscribed on the inside of the band, meant to be a secret between the giver and the receiver. A posy ring would easily play into the tradition that clergymen wear a wedding band on their fourth finger, in order to symbolize their marriage to the church. The first posy ring to be placed, coincidentally, is in fact on the fourth finger of St. Blaise's hand, likely because the thumb would be the symbol of the Father, the pointer finger a symbol of the Son, and the middle finger a symbol of the Holy Ghost. Therefore, the bishop's ring would go on to the fourth finger. This practice of being married to the church stems from the legend of St. Catherine, in which she participates in a mystical marriage to Christ. From this, the nuns would wear a wedding ring as a symbolism of their marriage to Christ, and priests would wear one as a symbol of their marriage to the church. In the medieval period, a ring is tied to the idea of completeness. Giving someone a ring would be like giving them a piece of yourself. This is marriage. In my mind, it makes sense for a religious figure to want to bind themselves with the saint, to increase their connection to such a holy person, to connect their town to them. That would be the ultimate blessing. The marriage between bishop and saint could also be intended to provide a living incarnation of St. Blaise. As a physician and the patron saint of the throat, he had a unique position to heal, as well as an inclination to do so. In times of illness, the vow between priest and saint could be intended to provide a blessing of healing over the patrons of this cathedral. Despite all of these promises, as time went on, the placement of the ring stopped. Perhaps it was due to Protestant Revolution, which hit Brunswick in 1543, leading to the cathedral being separate from the society for a few years, and according to some was when it was first converted into a Lutheran church. It is also possible that St. Blaise simply went out of fashion. Since the mid-16th and early 17th century, references to him are rare, leading to now where he is no longer one of the most prized saints of the Catholic Church. Whatever the reason, for those 540 years, the arm was interacted with in a unique and empowering way. If it is in fact a timeline of each clergy head that came through what was originally a little church and eventually became one of the greatest cathedrals in Germany, it shows what each man had and what he needed. These rings are like a contract, bonding promises with blessings and signifying a greater bond with direct connections to those required blessings. Thank you.
As Mass transpires in front of Ambrogio Lorenzetti's Maestà altarpiece, senses are fully engaged in smelling incense, hearing music, and watching the priest reverently touch and eat the host, or sacramental bread of the Eucharist. Commissioned by Augustine friars in 1335, those participating in Mass would recognize St. Augustine's theological ideas embedded in the altarpiece's complex iconographical scheme. As founder of the Augustinian order, St. Augustine's texts have formed the basis for many past arguments of this work's iconography. However, no investigation of the material emphasis and its inherent Augustinian textual basis has been conducted. I assert that Augustine's writings on the devotional role of the senses is foundational for approaching this painting's underlying theme of apprehending the material Christ incarnate through depictions of and direct engagement with the five senses. The prominence of St. John the Evangelist and his glowing white gospel book draws the viewer's eyes to the underlying theme of the painting found in John's gospel, that is, Logos, or the Word made flesh. This tangible materiality of Christ being presented to the five senses is a theme in the book of John and is elaborated on in Augustine's writing. Augustine teaches that the bodily senses aid the faithful in worship until the soul can be directed by the divine Logos. The wealth of St. Augustine's writings on the senses heavily informs the iconography of this altarpiece. A simple comparison with contemporary altarpieces, such as Cimabuy's Maestà, demonstrates the need for Ambrogio's iconographical innovation in order to reflect the theological complexity of Augustine's ideas. Of particular note, due to the Johannine theme of this painting, is an examination of Augustine's tractates on the Gospel of John, which reveals a rich discourse of the corporeal world and the physical senses. He entreats one to look, lift your eyes and your bodily senses to us, and yet not to us but to the gospel itself, to the evangelist himself. But lift your heart to the Lord to be filled. A recurring theme throughout the tractates is that the faithful must ever keep their eyes fixed on God, giving superiority to vision above the other senses. Because of the supremacy of vision, I will begin with sight. The allegorical figures of the three cardinal virtues draw on Augustine's teachings of the three levels of vision. Faith resides on the lowest step as the basest means of vision, called corporeal vision, that refers to anything perceived by the eyes alone. In ascending to a higher level, hope represents spiritual vision, or what can only be seen in the mind. Charity holds a heart aloft, drawing on a wealth of Augustinian literature concerning sight. Worshippers are instructed to lift their hearts to God and see with intellectual vision, the highest of the three. Charity stands as the last guardian between the viewer and Christ in a visualization of Augustine's words, which state, "How else can the intellect be seen except by intellect? In this way we also see charity, by which we draw near to God and finally God himself." By representing intellectual vision with the figure of charity, Ambrogio reflects Augustine's frequent example of love in explaining intellectual vision. The saint likens the heart, the cleansing of the heart, through which God can be seen, to the cleansing of the eyes. Returning to faith, it must be noted that this figure goes beyond merely representing the sense of sight, but directly engages it in an exercise of corporeal vision. The red background of the mirror is bull, a material used for preparatory gilding. This was gilded with highly reflective silver leaf, and the incisions delineate the details of a dove emerging from two heads, forming the Trinity. The dove would have been painted in white and then incised to render the details, exposing the silver leaf. The mirror is positioned such that as the priest kneels at this altarpiece, he sees his own face reflected with the image of the Trinity. In this way, the viewer uses corporeal vision to see the unseeable, as a trope to see something that is only intellectually perceived. Augustine writes that God is the light of our minds, and in the next life, the eyes of our minds will be suited to see that light. Ambrogio invites the viewer to first participate in corporeal vision in this mirror, and then remind the viewer that the ultimate goal is intellectual vision, with which we will be able to see the Trinity. Augustine writes, again quoting Johannine text, that it does not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when we see him, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Augustine clarifies that we will see him to the extent that we are like him. He explains that his likeness must be found in the inner self, which is renewed by daily worship until we are suited to see God face to face. The unknown nature of one's appearance or state at that day is underscored by the lack of reflection when looking directly at the painted faces of the Trinity. Due to the incised details revealing the silver leaf below, the dove of the Holy Spirit is made partly of the viewer's reflection and partly of the paint, like the rest of the Trinity. This hybrid materiality indicates the Holy Spirit's intermediary role in renewing the inner self as expressed in this verse. But we all, with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are changed into the same image from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord. Ambrogio's use of silver leaf is unusual because of the material's destructive quality. In Cennini's famous handbook for painters, he warns specifically against using silver leaf in any circumstance, including on panel, because it will turn black. Ambrogio's choice of silver leaf is then especially significant, not only for its reflective likeness to a mirror, but also for its distinctly destructive nature. Most likely, Ambrogio intentionally chose silver leaf because of the impending process of oxidization. Another examination of Augustinian texts provides an explanation for Ambrogio's inclusion of this transformative element. Seeing one's reflection with the faces of the Trinity harkens to Augustine's notion of the creation of man in the image of God, that human intellect, will, and memory are vestiges of the Trinity. Augustine likens these vestiges in the soul to a mirror tarnished by the stain of sin. The Pauline verse is again referenced, for now we see through a glass darkly, and then face to face. The conspicuous decay of the silver reminds the viewer of several scriptures concerning the corroding and eventual purifying of silver. Frequent references can be found to the dross, cankering, and rust of silver, as one heaps together treasure for the last days. Here, Ambrogio demonstrates the vainness of the material world through his material emphasis. The deterioration of the physical and of vain riches can also be compared to the mortal state of hearts, as seen in Faith's gesture towards her heart. The apparent need to restore the silver leaf would be a constant reminder of the necessity of cleansing the heart at the Master's hand, as he is a refiner and purifier of silver. The purification process is necessary to eventually comprehend the Trinity, a process only made possible through the sensory apprehension of Christ incarnate. Second, the sense of smell is clearly demonstrated by the angels smelling flowers and by the angels swinging censers or incense burners. Third, angels kneel at the base of the throne, singing and playing musical instruments. Remarkably, this is one of the earliest, and indeed has been claimed as the very first instance in the Italian Renaissance, that angels are engaged in the act of music making in a maestà scene. Previously, angels with instruments typically held them still. Undeniably, this innovation is a deliberate choice by Ambrogio to communicate active sound. Fourth, a prominent display of hands throughout the composition emphasizes the tactility of Christ in the flesh. Most pronounced is the intimate interaction between Mary and Christ himself, and he handles the Virgin's garment as a reminder that she clothed him in flesh. John's dramatic hand gesture leads to the painting's theme, and most of the saints' hands are held up in prayer. St. Francis prays in the orant gesture to display his stigmatized hands, emphasizing the flesh wounds given him without touch. The hands of the throne angels, which emphatically grasp the cushion, indicate the tangibility of new flesh upon the Ark of the Covenant, or mercy seat. Their wings create the throne supporting the Virgin as an unmistakable parallel to the Old Testament Ark that repelled touch and even inflicted death upon any that lay their hands upon it. This former repellent of touch is manifested by the Old Testament prophets isolated in the back, furthest from the mercy seat and furthest from any sensory engagement. The hands of the prophets closest to the throne have been effectively excised to underscore this veiled interaction. Finally, the sense of taste is notably absent, reflecting the lack of taste's literal representation within worship services. Taste is continually referred to metaphorically in John's and in Augustine's writings, and is also experienced metaphorically in the Mass. As worshippers see the near tasteless host being eaten, they also eat the Eucharist. The most commonplace mention of taste is in relation to the holy name of Jesus. Augustine writes, "The name of God is sweet above every delight of the world. You may praise the sweetness of honey with whatever language you choose, but unless one has tasted honey, he does not understand what you mean. So it is with the name of God, they alone know it who have tasted it." The adoration of the surrounding saints as they hold up hands in prayer or cover their heart alludes to tasting the sweetness of the holy name of Jesus. Because Augustine does not leave any textual description of taste, as it is beyond such, Ambrogio likewise excludes it in its literal application. In review, it is notable that the angels and allegories, though not of the corporeal realm, are the sole figures participating explicitly in the five senses. This echoes Augustine's idea that the office of angels is to administer to the corporeal world and use its symbolic likenesses to teach men. Ambrogio's innovative depictions of the angels leading this Augustinian sensory engagement guides the worshipper in a purification of the heart through apprehending the Christ incarnate.
A woman peers into the face of a ghostly, eerie child. The woman reaches her hand out in disbelief of what she sees. The bare room provides little distraction from the haunting figures, and thus the viewer's eye is left to dart between the woman's reaching hand and the airy girl's vacant expression. For centuries, Jacobus Brel's work, including this one, Woman at a Window Waving to a Child, have been labeled as a genre scene of everyday life. Through careful analysis of the figures, setting, symbols, contemporary art, and history, this image can be more correctly categorized as a mystic image about the grief that follows the death of a child. Traditionally, historians have taken two approaches when interpreting Dutch art. One approach is a moral reading, where messages might be about death, with visual clues like skulls, clocks, decaying fruit, or bubbles, all focusing on the fleetingness of life. A moral painting might also warn of the dangers of money or vanity. The second approach is to classify an image as a genre scene, or an everyday image of typical figures doing everyday activities, such as working in their homes. Vrel's Woman at a Window disrupts the system because it does not comfortably fit with either of these two approaches. Although there is limited discussion about Vrel's artwork, his works are usually lumped into a category of subpar genre scenes. I assert that Woman at a Window is missing many of the elements that would label it as such, first being the figure. The woman is not shown doing anything, a necessary component of genre scenes. Other Vrel paintings do obviously show everyday work, such as interiors with a woman combing a little girl's hair and women at a hearth. This Vrel image shows what one can be assumed to be a woman chatting with a neighbor or a passerby. One can clearly see the sewing that lays at the table, temporarily put aside by the woman. This shows that even if she was not doing work at the exact moment captured by the artist, there was work being done at some point, which adds a sense of authenticity to the image. In contrast, Vrel's image of Woman at the Window does not have any allusion to a form of work, thus making it vastly different than other representations of daily life. Another curious feature of this woman is how dramatically she leans into the window to see the child. The woman's urgency is peculiar because there is no response from the little girl. The child looks blankly back, while the woman seems to defy gravity and physics in her rush lean to the window. The actions of her body suggest that this is not simply a neighborhood girl passing by, but more of a shocking or startling situation, like possibly a dreamlike hallucination of her deceased daughter. The lack of daily tasks and strange movements of the woman hint to an idea of something different than a genre scene. But this melancholy idea of conjuring one's dead child is also mirrored with the setting and the mood of the image. The ceiling is too high and elusive, the walls jut out from the window at very peculiar angles, and the angles of the room don't even match each other, creating an asymmetrical room. Not even the curtains hang evenly. The nail on the right corner of the image is easy to ignore, but I think purposeful by Vrel. It appears the nail should be holding something, as we see in interiors with a woman combing a little girl's hair. But instead, it hangs empty, mirroring the woman's emptiness and loss. Every aspect of the setting is unbalanced, matching the unhinged woman who sits in the room. Furthering the curious nature is the darkness of the window. Why would a little girl be out at night, and why would a woman have her curtains open at night? Contemporary floor plans show that there would not be a window opening into the next room, so the window must be looking out into the dark night, not an adjoining room. The window actually provides additional evidence for the mystic interpretation I am suggesting. Instead of using a normal, typical window molding, Vrel puts in a window in a bedbox frame. A bedbox frame, when used normally, as Vrel does in his other works of art, is placed around the bed so one can enter, pull the curtains shut when sleeping to keep out the cold. Vrel's usage of the bedbox as a frame for the window is actually unthinkable for the time and would be totally inappropriate. By placing the window in a bedbox frame, it alludes to the idea that the window and the bed have a correlation. Vrel is making a direct comparison to the fact that the window is playing the same role of bedwood, a dreamer's portal into a different world. Furthermore, it is believed that if someone died in bed, then their soul and spirit could cling to the bed, making it unusable for others, and causing the whole house to lapse into turmoil. I assert that the figure, setting, and now the bedbox all discredit the claim that this is a genre scene, and instead support the idea that this is an image of grief, with the subject using the bedbox window as a portal to envision her dead child. Further support of this idea of grief is the symbols in the room that properly identify her emotions. Vrel is purposeful in signing his name on the handkerchief. While most art historians label this a piece of paper, I contend that this is a handkerchief, a timeless symbol of weeping. The handkerchief has traditionally been in representation in art, especially during this time period, of wiping away tears and dealing with sorrow. This woman was weeping over her dead child, mopping her tears with a handkerchief, when to her shock appeared at her bed frame window her dead child. While the subject of grief is not a common theme in Dutch art, painting death itself does occur. It is just more removed from the suffering or loss and focuses on the documenting of lives. Dead Girl by Bartholomew Vanderhelst shows a dead child laying on a mattress of straw. The little child is startlingly pale and surrounded by symbols of death. Theodore van Thuden painted Josina van Westrum and her children with 5 children, even though 2 of her children had already died at the time of this painting. Both Vanderhelst and van Thuden demonstrate how common it was to paint death, but like so many of their time, they ignore the emotions regarding death and focus on just documenting life. Vrel provides an unusually authentic interpretation of death by focusing on the inconsolable distress of a mother after losing a child. Based on the obvious lack of symbols Vrel admits, it's clear that Vrel wanted this image to be about grief and loss, not death. If he wanted the image to be about death, common symbols like straw, funeral torches, bubbles, clocks, or skulls that show the impending doom would have been added. Instead, by keeping it free from the contemporary symbols of death, the focus remains on the one symbol present, the handkerchief and the grief associated with it. History supports the fact that many parents would have been devastated by loss due to the shocking number of infant and child deaths during this time period. During this time in the Dutch Republic, more than half of all children failed to survive their first year of life. According to historians, it would have been difficult to find any woman who did not have some cause to mourn. Research also shows that family was very important during this era, and death would have made an impact, regardless of how common it was. These staggering facts about contemporary life really place into perspective the mourning that must have occurred. Vrel is just one of the few to depict it with so much raw emotion. One way to overcome sorrow during the 17th century was to turn to the scriptures. One is expected to grieve, but one was also to trust in God and eventually find the memory of the deceased not upsetting, but joyful. The suggested antidote for sorrow was to read the Bible. Interestingly, Vrel paints an image similar to a woman at the window, but instead shows the woman turned from the window reading the Bible. Below the woman is a handkerchief, again the symbol of weeping. But instead of turning to the window and the child standing at it, the woman sits solidly on a stubby chair reading the Bible. She seems to have overcome the sorrow and loss through turning into the scriptures. Her glasses and wrinkles suggest she is older, so perhaps this is showing an older woman who has experienced the sorrows of death, but time and scriptures have somewhat healed her wounds. The woman is no longer in the raw stages of grieving of visions and dreams, but has transitioned into a state of more peace. Although she appears calmer with her lack of movement, there is still a reminder that she is weeping with the handkerchief by her feet. Freud, an authority on psychoanalysis, claimed that mourning takes time and is a long and drawn-out process. Furthermore, he states that the conscious knowledge of his loss will never leave the normal person. This painting supports that grief will never leave her completely, even while she is consoled by the scriptures. Vrel paints many women, all doing daily tasks of life, so it's not unrealistic to wonder if perhaps she is simply waving to a little girl. But further investigation into the figures of this scene show that this is not a mundane object. It's exactly the opposite. The lack of action, unsettled room, eerie tone, and jarring movements all declassify this image as a genre scene. The woman intensely reaching for the ghostly girl is the first indicator that this is a mystic, dreamlike scene focusing on the suffering of losing a child. The bedbox window frame, handkerchief, and the lack of other contemporary images of death further illustrate that this is not a typical image and must be classified as an image on grieving. Pairing the visual clues with the historical analysis of the time, the Dutch family, this leaves little room for question on the extent of the death and suffering that occurred in the home and the impact that it had. Finally, Vrel's other image demonstrates that he was aware of typical practices and customs, and thus was purposeful in placing one woman turned from her grief towards the Bible and another towards her grief and the dreamlike vision she conjured up in the anguish of losing a child. Perhaps in one way, our historians correctly label this as an everyday scene. For this woman, this is the everyday. Her grief haunts her daily and keeps her suffering. While death is truly the excruciating event, Vrel demonstrates that it's those who left behind that truly suffer a death of their own.
It has been said that the story of Joan of Arc is too beautiful and too terrible to ignore. In the mid-1920s, historians discovered an unfinished painting of Joan of Arc, which dates to around 1620. Since then, scholars have attributed the painting to the famous Flemish painter, Peter Paul Rubens. The image painted by Rubens celebrates Joan of Arc's role as heroine and divine virgin, for she brought France to victory through the power of God. Joan is depicted in full armor, piously kneeling before a stone altar that has a crucifix of the Savior, her beloved King of Heaven. The gaze of the young maid seems to go right past the altar, where a light appears to be shining on her face and armor, perhaps a divine light. Her hands are raised in prayer, with her mouth slightly open, as if she is about to speak to the heavenly messengers whom she received guidance from. Scholars have considered the patronage of the painting, yet continue to be uncertain. However, they do not offer an adequate analysis of the image's subject matter in relation to its time. In 1622, Rubens was commissioned by the recently exiled Queen Marie de' Medici of France to depict a glorified biography of her life through a series of 24 paintings. Rubens' propaganda paintings, known as the Medici cycle, became key in re-establishing Marie de' Medici as a righteous, peacemaking hero. Interestingly, there are distinct parallels between Marie de' Medici and Joan of Arc, both in art and life. I contend that Marie de' Medici not only empathized and aligned herself with the legend of the young maid, but commissioned Rubens to paint Joan of Arc for her own palace. Having been inspired by God, Joan led France to a liberating victory against the English during the 100 Years' War in the early part of the 15th century. Some viewed her as a chosen, God-fearing individual, and others saw her as a heretic witch. Her story ends tragically, for she was burned at the stake. The years following her death showed a transition from criticism to praise, resulting in her becoming a pious, even courageous symbol for France. Rubens and his painting of the young maiden is an early example of Joan of Arc being illustrated as a saintly and revered figure. Additionally, writers, poets, clergy, and scholars began publishing books in honor of Joan in the early 17th century. These accounts praised her and invoked her as an Amazon of antiquity. Historian Etienne Pasquier said, quote, "No service ever made to France can be compared to the maid's," end quote. Joan of Arc's transition from heretic to hero is extremely unique, yet one woman could relate and illustrate her life in a similar manner, Marie de' Medici. Marie was born to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Francis de' Medici, and Joanna of Austria in 1575. At the age of 25, Marie became the second wife to King Henry IV of France and received her royal status. Only 10 years later, King Henry died, and Marie became a widow as well as Regent Queen of France until her son, Louis XIII, was old enough to rule. Marie struggled as Regent Queen, and in 1617 found herself in exile after her son rebelled against her at the age of 15. During her time in exile, there was a continuation of both political and public debate regarding her royal status. In 1619, the afflicted queen was able to return to France and eventually reunite with her son. The next few years were dedicated to reconciling with her son, Louis XIII, and reestablishing herself as a legitimate queen mother with a strong female identity. In order to renew her image as Queen of France, Marie de' Medici hired Peter Paul Rubens to paint a series of paintings for the recently built Luxembourg Palace, her new private residence. In the contract between Marie and Rubens, the painter agreed, quote, to draw and paint with his own hand 24 pictures in which shall be represented the histories and the very illustrious life and her heroic deeds of the said queen." End quote. In a similar way that Rubens portrays Joan of Arc, a once considered heretic, now symbol of France, he portrays Marie de' Medici, ostracized and disputed monarch, as a peacemaking hero. One can argue through specific evidence that Marie de' Medici commissioned the painting of Joan of Arc. However, scholars have speculated otherwise. Some have considered that Rubens painted the painting for his personal collection, or that it was commissioned by French scholar Nicolas Claude Pierresque. Pierresque was close with Rubens and served as an intermediary between the painter and the queen's advisors. Pierresque and Rubens exchanged letters which often included praise and appreciation for the painter by the queen. Additionally, Pierresque was involved with the publication for proposed inscriptions for a monument to Joan at Orléans in France during 1617 to 1628. Many of the people who contributed inscriptions dedicated to Joan for the publication were associates of Pierresque, including Rubens, King Louis XIII, and the regent queen herself, Marie de' Medici. It is evident that each one of these individuals admired and had praise for Joan of Arc. There are many accounts documenting the exchange between Pierresque and Rubens. Scholars have analyzed the relationship and history of these two men and have tried to conclude that Rubens' painting of Joan was associated or influenced by their work. Scholar Elizabeth McGrath has stated, quote, "Certainly it seems like that it was meant for a French client, if not Pierresque himself." End quote. I contend that it was intended for a French client, that of Marie de' Medici. The Regent Queen of France easily could have identified herself with the story of Joan of Arc. The Queen empathized with the Joan of Arc figure because both women were clearly considered outcasts at one point and went through a period of re-identification. As previously stated, Marie desired that Rubens illustrate her heroic deeds, much like the depiction of Joan of Arc. The rising cult of Joan of Arc allowed Marie to see the young maiden in many roles, including that of peacemaker, caretaker, and protector of France, as well as pious virgin, all attributes the Queen desired to visually establish for herself. Scholar Deborah Marrow, in her book, The Art Patronage of Marie de' Medici, documents Marie's commission of several strong female pieces. She says, quote, 17th century contracts and letters have made it clear that in the case of the Luxembourg Palace, Marie ordered an entire building to be decorated with monumental autobiographical paintings as well as illustrations of famous women, various female deities, and allegorical figures to whom she was compared. The imagery of these projects is not androgynous. Rather, in most cases, it is strongly female. Support for the Queen's deliberate choice of female imagery comes from other arts as well." End quote. This piece of evidence is imperative to my argument. Pierresque and Rubens proposed suggestions as to which females should be represented in this building dedicated to figures of whom Marie compared herself with. Pierresque, Rubens, and Marie de' Medici had written proposed text for the popular tourist attraction and monument of Joan at Orléans. It is obvious Marie de' Medici found interest in the young maiden, and she also fit the profile of a strong female. Marrow furthers this argument by saying, quote, "The theme of virtuous women was popular in French writing, where Marie was often compared to her other illustrious historical and legendary predecessors, including Saint Helen and Joan of Arc." End quote. Not only did Marie order an entire building to be decorated with images of strong women, but the Regent Queen associated herself with the young maid, Joan of Arc. It is appropriate to assume Marie de' Medici commissioned the Joan of Arc portrait painted by Rubens as part of her large commission of strong female figures. It is clear that Marie de' Medici sought to portray herself with similar attributes as Joan in her biographical portraits done by Rubens. In the portrait titled Marie de' Medici as Queen Triumphant, Marie stands in an authoritative stance dressed in regal clothing, with long hair and one breast exposed. Just as Joan of Arc was painted as being divinely chosen by God, Marie is shown with the divine light descending upon her. One can clearly see how Rubens endorses her as a heroine by endowing her with both male and female virtues. In order to increase her validity as a ruler, she holds a scepter. By surrounding and dressing his subject with objects of male warriors, helmet, armor, cannon, and guns, Rubens implies Marie de' Medici can govern wisely and lead France to glory. By examining Joan of Arc and Marie de' Medici as Queen Triumphant, one can view that Marie commissioned the Joan of Arc painting because Joan was a powerful and peaceful heroine who she desired to emulate. There are numerous publications reciting the interrogation of Joan of Arc, and they can easily lead one to weep. She was called by God and desired to serve him as well as her country, even if it meant to die an unjust death at the stake. Mark Twain stated, quote, "Every fact of her life was distorted, perverted, reversed. She was incredibly misunderstood. To know Joan of Arc was to know one who was wholly noble, pure, truthful, brave, a character supremely great." End quote. With the rising of Joan's popularity in the early 17th century, there is no wonder why Marie de' Medici identified with the young maiden. Evidence has proven that Marie was active in promoting Joan of Arc and probably commissioned Rubens' painting for her personal palace, dedicated to female portraits of whom the queen compared herself with. Joan of Arc was the heroine whom Marie de' Medici sought to be. By examining the parallels between Marie de' Medici and Joan of Arc, both in art and life, I contend that Marie de' Medici commissioned Rubens to paint Joan of Arc for her own palace. Thank you.
Though Kazimir Malevich ardently asserted his Ukrainian status, he has historically been considered a Russian artist. He's famous specifically as a member of the Russian avant-garde and father of suprematism. However, historical data supports the idea that Malevich identified himself as a Ukrainian, and additional evidence substantiates that his Ukrainian nationalism deeply affected his work. The widespread miscategorization of Kazimir Malevich has biased interpretation of his work and has decreased many scholars' understanding of Malevich himself. For example, this painting, Peasant Between a Cross and a Sword, has largely been ignored, despite the fact that it was painted during the time of the Holodomor, a forced famine genocide carried out by Soviet authorities in Ukraine during 1932 and 33. Kazimir Malevich painted this painting, and it stands as one compelling example of his deliberate depiction of the Ukrainian plight under Soviet authority, and further indicates how his work was influenced by Ukrainian history and folk art. Despite many examples, such as this one, and evidences of Malevich's Ukrainian status, he has never been seriously considered as a Ukrainian artist in an academic setting. Therefore, focusing on Ukrainian nationalism within the Soviet Union and the modern art movement, historical evidence proving Malevich's status as a Ukrainian, and a cultural and stylistic analysis of Peasant Between a Cross and a Sword as a case study, I assert that Malevich and his work must be viewed within a Ukrainian-specific context in order to be accurately understood. The event referenced by Peasant is known by several names. Some call it the famine. Others call it Stalin's forced famine. However, the most haunting name, in my opinion, is Holodomor, which is a Ukrainian word that can be translated as murder by hunger. Between 1932 and 33, the Holodomor killed an estimated 6 to 14 million Ukrainians. Despite the gross tragedy of the event, it wasn't officially recognized anywhere in the world as a genocide until 2006. This monument, completed in 2006, was the first official recognition of the Holodomor in Ukraine. Before the creation of this monument, the Holodomor was not discussed as an official historical event, even inside Ukraine. As we look at peasant, we can see many specific elements of the Holodomor referenced. The painting shows a highly stylized, angular, bearded man positioned between a red cross and a bloodied sword. The Holodomor targeted Ukrainian peasants most specifically, a group of people which can be represented by this bearded man. The man stands facing the cross with one arm outstretched, with the sword at his back. The man's position of being caught between two symbols of death bespeaks the reality of the Holodomor in that people could give their grain to the soldiers who came to their houses and starve through the winter, or they could refuse and be shot on the spot. In depicting the Holodomor, Malevich clearly indicates that he is working within a nationalistic framework. However, as we look more closely at the image of Malevich and his personal statements concerning his nationality, we'll see even more clearly the Ukrainian nature of his work. Although the issue of national identity within the Soviet Union can contain many blurred lines, it is a subject on which Malevich was very direct. He was born in 1878 in the Kyiv region of Ukraine to a Ukrainian mother and a Polish father. As a child, he spoke Ukrainian and Polish at home, and in his public life, he spoke either Ukrainian or, as he put it, Russian, peppered with Ukrainian phrases. After living in Russia for a number of years, Malevich returned to Ukraine and published 14 articles in Ukrainian. This is significant as speaking Ukrainian in public during this time, let alone publishing in Ukrainian, was an offense for which many people were sent to the Gulag. In addition to using language as an identifying characteristic, Malevich chose to identify himself as a Ukrainian national on all official documents. In a biography compiled after his death, Malevich's sister detailed that in addition to marking himself as a Ukrainian on government documents, he loudly insisted that his friends and family ought to do the same, despite the serious danger associated with being a nationalistic Ukrainian. Malevich chose to openly embrace his culture and homeland through these types of overt acts. In addition to these overt acts, Malevich also participated in the Ukrainian folk arts and craft movement of the 1920s. During this time, Malevich learned how to knit and embroider. Malevich's choice to learn to do embroidery is interesting because it is one of the folk arts most closely associated with Ukrainian identity. Ukrainian folk song suggests that an embroidered shirt was all a young person leaving home for the first time needed in order to remember their family and heritage. Also noteworthy, many displaced Ukrainians in the 20th century were ordered to leave all of their embroidery behind. However, many of them chose to face beatings and even death instead of abandoning their folk art. Then, significantly, the striking striped pattern Malevich uses in peasant is very similar to the basic patterns also found throughout Ukrainian embroidery. In these images, we can see the striped pattern commonly found throughout the traditional Ukrainian embroidery and their placement on the traditional vyshyvanka, or a Ukrainian shirt. The similarities between the striped ground and traditional embroidery suggest an inherent Ukrainianness to the land depicted. By painting the ground in thick, embroidery-like stripes, Malevich not only ties himself into the nationalistic embroidery culture, but also identifies the painting and the tragedy of the Holodomor as distinctively Ukrainian. Malevich also uses the bright colors of yellow, blue, with black and red that evoked folk imagery and nationalistic thought. Specifically within Ukrainian folk art, these colors hold special Christian and pagan significance. Ukrainians understand yellow as a symbol of light, purity, and the harvest. It's also associated with deities and is the Christian symbol of recognition and reward. Green symbolizes the freedom gained by breaking bondage, and in Christian tradition symbolizes hope of life over death. Red and black are two of the most common colors used. Red is associated with taking positive action, while black has the most complicated meaning of all the colors. It can symbolize eternity, constancy, as well as death, fear, or ignorance. These are all colors used by Malevich in peasant. Recognizing then that Malevich grew up in village atmospheres and learned traditional craft techniques from the peasants themselves, it is extremely likely that he knew of these color associations. Thus, the ground does not only represent an inherent Ukrainianness, it is also imbued with meanings about the reward, freedom, and life of Ukrainians in the midst of confusion, death, bondage, and destruction. Malevich uses colors significant to Ukrainian culture as a way to document a much deeper experience within the Holodomor than is initially visible to a non-Ukrainian viewer. In an autobiography written in 1933, Malevich recalled that as a boy, he watched with great excitement how the peasants made wall paintings and would help them smear the floor of their huts with clay and make designs on the stove. It seems notable that Malevich recalled the impact of primitive peasant-style painting, such as the one shown here, in the same year that he chose to create Peasant. The primitive style utilized in Peasant does not convey the typical connotations of a simplistic primeval society. Rather, Malevich's use of primitivism in this painting conveys a reverence by the use of a style that elevates folk art and represents the national consciousness. As he did with his use of colors, Malevich uses the simplistic folk designs to connect with a deeper, even more spiritual meaning. Malevich utilized further intense nationalistic symbols by showing the peasant figure as moving toward the cross. After returning to Ukraine from Russia, Malevich rediscovered icons. In a correspondence with a friend, he wrote that he felt some kinship and something splendid in the icons, and that he came to understand the peasants through them. Understanding that Malevich felt a deep connection between religious imagery and the peasantry, his placement of the peasant moving toward the cross becomes more understandable. In Malevich's mind, life as a peasant could best be understood through religious means. Knowing this, it is important to carefully consider the interaction Malevich creates between the religious symbols and the peasantry. Through his use of color, religious symbolism, and the imagery of the land, Malevich ties tones of deep spirituality into his depiction of the Holodomor. Although peasant is the only image I've discussed in detail, it's important to note that other images bear the same influence of traditional folk art. For example, one of Malevich's earliest figural works, done in 1913, features the same striped ground. And we can see the same striped ground and a similar color palette in his Head of a Peasant, done at the end of his life in 1934. In fact, this striped ground and particular color palette can be seen in almost all of his peasant-centered pieces. Understanding the connection between Malevich and Ukrainian folk art and nationalism makes possible a fuller understanding and appreciation of his works. In exploring a peasant between a cross and a sword, we can see more fully how Malevich sought to depict Ukrainian oppression experienced during the Holodomor and during the Soviet regime, specifically during Stalin's reign of terror. In Peasant, viewers can see that Malevich was directly influenced by Ukrainian history and folk art and used elements of both of these to inform his work. Though he is most famous for having created the first painting to lack any type of subject, many of his paintings dealt with deeply political and moving motifs. Therefore, using Peasant as an example, we can see the dire need to interpret all of Malevich's oeuvre in the proper historical context. In order for Kazimir Malevich or his art to be truly understood, he must be considered a Ukrainian working under duress in the Soviet Union. In addition to gaining an enhanced understanding of Malevich and his work, recognizing Kazimir Malevich as a Ukrainian will begin to correct some of the misconceptions started by the Soviet state, which are still propagated today. Kazimir Malevich deserves to have his Ukrainian legacy honored, and Ukrainians deserve the honor of recognizing him as one of their own.
Power, precision, and respect are fundamental elements of culture in the 17th century Japan. Among the many forms of art in Japan, panel paintings and hanging scrolls were the most popular forms during the 16th century. In particular interest towards 16th century Japanese art is that of the artist Kaiho Yusho, who is known for his magnificent and large panel paintings. He is best known for his Unyuzu series and his Kagizuzu series. This presentation focuses on the drama and history seen in his Unyuzu paintings. A samurai by birth, but an artist and a religious man through life, Kaiho Yusho created a lasting and flourishing art style in both the Chinese Chan Zen Buddhist style and of the flourishing golden floral and landscapes of Japanese art style. The purpose is to understand the curiosity of the dragon painting and how it applies to Kaiho's commentary on the struggle for power through patronage. The series of Dragon in the Clouds shows the entwined belief of dragon deities and the self-reflective Zen Buddhism demonstrating power towards religion and not in the government or the warring classes. When trying to understand the scenes on the screens, the viewer must also understand the cultural and historical significance associated with these paintings. The time period of war and unification is known as the Momoyama. During this time, the emperor's power had almost completely diminished, and all power belonged to the samurai warlords of the region. A tip in the scale provided the means for a shogun warlord named Oda Nobunaga to lead the way for his predecessors to a unified Japan. Oda Nobunaga was either highly admired or highly disliked by the populace, and more particularly those of the upper warring classes that obtained their wealth and power through the politics of war. It was not only the drive from Oda, but those that were associated with him and later succeeded him. Cummings stated, "The drive towards unification of the country by Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and finally Tokugawa Ieyasu." This historical drama. Interestingly enough, the reign of Nobunaga ended when he was killed shortly after in 1582. Hideyoshi and then Ieyasu, retainers of Nobunaga, followed after him and continued the work of unification. In the first part of Kaiho's career, the unification took place, overcoming the division of power and once more establishing one common rule. Kaiho himself was affected by all of this since his family was associated with other samurai that were opposed to Oda Nobunaga. The Kaiho family, a slightly lower class of samurai, devoted themselves to the Zai clan. Their household had strong ties to the land and was ideally situated in Kyoto Prefecture near Lake Biwa. During that time, Kyoto was important for trading routes and Buddhist pilgrimages. The defeat of the Zai clan meant the deaths and the deaths of their associates, including Kaiho's family. Because of antagonism from Nobunaga, Kaiho's resolve to stay within the protection of monastic life only grew stronger. Being the second or third son in the family and having very little chance of inheriting his family's house, the wealth and responsibilities that were associated with it, his parents thought it best to get their son out of the way of war and into the ways of Buddhism at a local temple. After the death of his family through means of war and ritual suicide, there was a more dramatic shift in his stance with the war and aimed more towards a career in painting at the age of 40. In his own way, Kaiho was using the way of an artist as a means to carry on his family's name and legacy. Even though he was no longer a samurai, he carried the tradition of samurais such as horseback archery, known as bushi, and created his own way through the arts. A scholar by the name of Hashimoto, in several accounts by Kaiho's wife and grandchild, describes Kaiho's intention of creating a future for a household that was destroyed. "I am a descendant of Kogen who fell in the profession of artist, and so I wish to pass on what my ancestors had in their mind and hand to my family's future generations and restore my family's honor as a bushi." His life with samurai activity almost completely vanished to make way for an artist. Around 1599, the head priest or abbot of Kanenji Temple ordered the interior to be remodeled. More than 52 paintings were commissioned by the abbot for Kaiho to paint. All but 2 of these paintings have survived the passage of time. There are no specifics as to what subject matter the abbot wanted. In an obvious sense, it would have to do with Zen Buddhism and inner self-reflected subject matter, and done in a monochromatic style of ink on paper. Of the 52 paintings that were created, 8 of them were dragons. Many of the monks' private living quarters were plain and simplistic. The minimalistic atmosphere offered plenty of opportunity for a monk or priest to spend their time in contemplation. The renovation that happened in 1599 allowed for a more vibrant and lively living space for monks and for patrons to visit. The main focus and personal doors for the abbot were the dragons. Understanding that visitors and monks alike would be in the temples, why would the Dragon and Cloud series, be located at the private quarters of the abbot? There are no confirmed documents that state that it was the same abbot that Kaiho was friends with, but it is with fair certainty that Kaiho's relationship and respect was far more towards this abbot than those of the aristocratic shogun classes. For most of his life, he was with the priest and was not with the shogun class. He was taught in ways of self-discovery and the importance of religion in daily life. Though there was samurai in his blood, there was the talents of an artist in his hands, which was recognized by the abbots of the Tofukuji and the Kinenji temples of Kyoto. Zen Buddhism is a form of Mahayana Buddhism and came around 6th century in China, but didn't truly make an appearance till near the late 11th century and 13th century of Japan, and has persisted ever since. This form of religion main purpose was to devote oneself to learning the reality and nature of their inner self and the reality of their surroundings. This type of Buddhism was especially popular among the upper class Bakufu and the aristocratic classes of Japan. One of the artists that gave inspiration to the younger Kaiho was that of Liang Kai. Liang Kai worked in both the aesthetics of the incredibly detailed and also an incredibly minimalistic art style that has captured the hearts of many of the Song dynasty of China. Since Zen Buddhism originated in China and rapidly spread, it is highly possible that Kaiho Yusho had seen some of Kai's artwork while studying at the temples in Kyoto. One of Kai's most famous pieces of art was monochromatic in style and very simplistic, yet complicated in line design and brushstroke. His Li Bo, chanting a poem, as a hanging scroll that eventually made its way through copies to the temples of Kyoto, where the young Kaiho was studying to become a painter. In the beginnings of Buddhist dragons, they were seen as either in opposition to Buddha or as a helpful hand to the Buddha in creation or within elements. The introduction of Buddhism in China invited the transformation of the long-standing traditions of deities that have power over the water and rain. These deities were then attributed to the understanding of one's inner self. The use of dragons and the understanding of dragons were then applied to the Chinese Chan Buddhism, later known as Zen Buddhism in China and in Japan. There are frequent references to dragons in Chinese Chan Buddhism that suggest their function as a metaphor to understanding ourselves and the surrounding universe. Like in other parts of Asia, Japanese dragons were ancient beings that were merged with Buddhism. Zen Buddhism were introduced later to Japan than most of the Asian countries, allowing Shinto and other religions to take deep root before that of Buddhism. Buddhism in general had a rough start with means towards power and control and did not leave the best first impressions. After some time, Buddhism became more and more popular, especially among the aristocratic and those with higher social standings. Buddhism allowed for a new type of flourishing of arts in writing, painting, architecture, and statuary. In fact, the Momoyama period, in which the Dragon and Cloud series came from, is known as one of Japan's golden ages of art. Kaiho's vast understanding of symbolic meanings behind that of the Dragon and Cloud series created mastery and richness. It is odd then that the dragons who were made were not for the emperor or for Nobunaga or even for Hideyoshi and Ieyasu, but was rather for those whom he spent much of his time with. The panel paintings were not of the power and authority of that of Nobunaga and other daimyo, but the commentary on the power and divine nature of the dragons and the association with the Zen Buddhists of Kyoto Prefecture. Thank you.
all be as proud as I am because I saw these in their beginning stages, and these were wonderful presentations. While everybody comes up for questioning, I'll turn the lights up, and we will be glad to take any questions that you might have for any of the speakers. And I'm going to ask you to ask Hannah, raise your hand, Hannah, questions first because she and Clarilyn both got accepted to a student symposium in Missouri, and they have to be up to the airport. Their plane leaves at 1:45, so they've got to get going. So if you have any questions for Hannah, please ask those first, and then we'll move on.
I think you and I have talked about this before, but I can't remember. How did you get away with publishing all of those articles in the trade?
They just ignored it.
Is it just because he was a high-profile enough artist that they were kind of afraid to lose their
It was
control?
right at a shift. So sometimes it was punished and sometimes it wasn't. Speaking Ukrainian became a more serious offense later in the 30s, and it began right after Lenin's death, really. So that he publishes mostly in the late 20s, and it's just kind of this fuzzy era where it was certainly dangerous, but yeah, I mean, he was well known enough that nothing happened in that moment. So.
Something I hadn't really ever paid attention to until today is how much it looks like Chagall. And I started wondering, because surrealism gets so associated with nationalist identity, nationalism, that I'm wondering if there's any contact between the two of them. And I mean, just the crosses and the colors and, just lots of things that reminded me of him. And I'm just wondering if there's, if he had contact with Chagall, if he had contact with surrealism, or artists who were practicing in that style at that time. I mean, it is such an incredible shift in his style from suprematism.
It's a really incredible shift. As far as I read, he had access to some of the exhibits that were going on outside of the Soviet Union, even though he wasn't able to leave until he was eventually kicked out. So he maybe saw Chagall. I don't know, it'd be something interesting to think about.
Yeah, it might help you with your nationalism, kind of, because you think of all of the artists, whether you're thinking of Heidi and working on Rick Kahlo and things. I mean, there's so much of that tied up into surrealism of national identity and going back to one's roots and primitivism and all of those kinds of things. I think it's an interesting connection that I hadn't made before that might help your case. Any other questions to Hannah? Yeah.
I just have to say, first of all, I was so impressed by everyone's presentation. That was a stunning show of papers. My question for you, Hannah, though, I have actually two questions. You can answer either of them. I'm wondering about what's going on with the left hand. I think the peasant looks like it's missing.
It's just
And then, it's okay. Well,
maybe you're a different color.
and then I'm also wondering, what kind of thoughts do you have about the similarity between the sword and the cross in terms of color and shape?
Yeah. I think that I'll answer the second question first, if that's okay. I think that the red is really significant. That it maybe was the more proactive choice to just to refuse to give your grain during the Holodomor and be killed rather than starve. There's some really haunting photos of the peasants who instead chose to starve. And for a little more context, I guess, they took their grain and moved them off of their farms so that Russian collective farmers could move in. And then they told these Russian collective farmers that they had just built these cities for them. And so the Russian farmers moved in, didn't necessarily know that they were moving into dead people's houses that had been killed for this specific reason. And I think that the mirroring of the cross imagery in the sword and the actual cross really does then relate that reality that regardless of the option they chose, death was imminent. And I think then that the red color of symbolizing positive action, I think that we ought to see the Ukrainians as being positively affected, not positively affected, but taking the best actions that they could in this scenario, and that regardless of which action that they chose, it would lead to their ultimate demise. The disappearing hand is interesting I think hands are just interesting in general, especially with saints, and I think that then the peasants as saints are interesting, and that it's behind his back. I'm not sure of all of the implications, but I think that there's a lot of interesting ideas that it does provide.
I'm also wondering if Elliot was making the connection, saints and martyrdom, swords and crosses, and that it comes from primitive sources, so that might have been a form of inspiration, and the pairing there might make some sense.
Yeah, that's another great point.
Okay, any other comments? If not, we'll let Hannah go and drive badly up to the airport, and good luck to both of you. Okay, now let us open up for all the rest of our speakers. Questions? Catherine?
I do. I have a comment first and then a question. My comment is for Rebecca. I really love the materiality, sensual kind of elements that you brought forward, and I was really struck by that figure holding the heart, and I was thinking of actually Augustine's discourse on the Psalms that talks about, not necessarily the heart being the mode by which you see, but the mode by which you desire constant union with God. He talks about that in this discourse. It might be helpful to strengthen your argument here, where he talks, especially because this is an altarpiece, and he talks about the groanings of the heart. He talks about desire for God and union with God, and this is the place that you approach for Eucharist. I thought that might be helpful to you, and I can give you a reference for that afterwards if you would like it.
That would be wonderful. I do pull extensively in his narration of the Psalms, and I've looked into it a lot. I would love to find that reference. It's interesting because we're constantly seeing this tension between the internal and the external, and how there's this tension between them within the painting. How even though we're apprehending through the senses, it is all coming back to the heart. So I'd love to find that reference. Thank you.
He mentioned specifically the heart, so
Wonderful.
I think you might like that.
Thank you.
And then my other question is for Eva. Is there a specific delineation between spinning and weaving for the Maya? I'm curious because very anciently there is a distinction. I mean, you can go back to Homer, for example, where you find spinners and weavers in the Iliad and the Odyssey, where you find Penelope and Helen who weave when their lives are uncertain, and then they go back to spinning as an act of creation, as an act of fate almost, when their even marital status is more secure. And so I'm curious to know if there's a distinction between kind of the iconographic but also philosophical distinction between spinning and weaving.
There definitely is a difference between spinning and weaving, and I was mostly focusing on weaving, but there are different articles that talk about spinning specifically. And in the goddesses, they're depicted, some of them have like a spindle on their head in their depictions. So yes, there is a distinction, and I didn't focus so much on spinning, so I wouldn't know how that, you mentioned Homer, and how that fits in for him. In the Maya, I'm not exactly sure what the difference between spinning and weaving is for them, but there is a
that might be something really strengthening and curious to examine further, especially within the arachnid iconography. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, Mary Margaret.
I have a question for Caitlin. Why do you think that God chose to sign on the handkerchief as opposed to anywhere else in the painting?
So there's a lot of mystery about who Rel really was. There's even like debates if it was a woman or not. There's a lot of different spellings of his name. That seems kind of weird, like how you don't forget how to spell your own name. So it's kind of thought that maybe it's like a kind of a cover name for maybe a couple people or just one. So I think that a lot of his images are about women, and they seem to me very much about like intimate details of a woman's life. So I actually think personally that Vrel was probably a woman painting under a man's name, kind of. And so I feel like he signs, and you see it in a couple different images. It's not just that one. You see it signing a couple different times, always on the handkerchief.
Is it also in the one of the women reading the Bible? Is that also signed on the handkerchief?
Yep, they're signed on the same one. There's another one of a woman who looks like she's kind of like leaning over, kind of again doing that thing. And there's an empty cradle as well. So I think a lot of times he's trying to associate himself or herself with the grief and kind of with the sorrows in a woman's life more, because I think it is a woman.
Yeah.
Can I just follow up on that? That was that's the most haunting painting. I thought your argument was like just profoundly convincing to me. And I wondered, and you may have no idea about this, but I'm just wondering, is there any kind of literature of ghost stories or kind of supernatural something or another's in Dutch 17th century? I mean, you don't associate that with the Dutch Republic, but I mean, it so looks just like a kind of eerie visitor from the other side of existence. I'm just wondering if there's any kind of larger context of ghosts with the Dutch.
Yeah, the only thing I could find is there's a lot of mention on dreams, but kind of not in a creepy, ghosty type, just kind of more like the dreams of a family or something like that. So I couldn't find anything. Maybe Martha could tell us more about more of just like the ghost side of it, just the dreams, which I kind of brought in my paper a little bit more, but I also didn't feel like it was a super strong, like I didn't feel like you could go from a jump about dreaming like during sleep to then this mystic as much. I feel like you need to have the ghost stories in there kind of, and because I didn't find that, I didn't feel like that was
you just don't think of the Dutch as being very mystical, you know? And yet I think you demonstrated it so powerfully with the visual evidence in that painting. So I mean, it just kind of changes the whole way I think about the Dutch in the 17th century.
But I think Caitlin is exactly right. There isn't a tradition of it. And what I think Caitlin has really done here in a more universal and really interesting way, she laid out for you the two ways of interpreting genre scenes in 17th century Dutch art. I think she's found a third way that really could be an interesting one to examine in terms of it's not just strictly describing and it doesn't have a moral, but it is an interiority, almost like we would find in a Rembrandt, a psychological kind. I think it's more of a psychological sort of analysis that Caitlin has done rather than a fusily, dreamlike kind of mysticism going on there. So I think she really hit the nail on the head in terms of the Dutch absolutely loved their children. They're notorious in the time period for loving their children. And I think it's the genre activity of grief that is more the point, not so much the mysticism of it all. But I think she's found a really interesting take that really we haven't investigated too much in Dutch art. So I think that's why it's really a significant contribution. Did I see Alan? Go
I just had a quick follow-up with Caitlin. You made a nice comparison between the woman in the window and the woman reading. Do you see those as companion pieces?
I thought about that. I actually don't think they are because, well, first of all, we know nothing about we really know nothing about Vrel at all. Actually, the one of the woman reading Bible was painted after, which is interesting. I think just the setting of the rooms don't match. If you notice, the ceilings are different. The first image, like my main thesis, you can't find like the ceilings out of the image. He doesn't paint it in. And the second one, there's actually like an oak paneled ceiling.
You may want to look at it though, because they are seen as being much older. There may have been differences, but if you notice the window itself, one of the repaired panes is the same in both of them. And it's the one that's directly over the face of the child.
Yeah.
So there is a connection probably between the fractured pane of glass and the dead child, which would reinforce that idea.
I would have all those examples of pendants where it's not the same room, but they are pendants like Vermeer's woman seated and standing at the Virgin or something like that, where they're like in theme, but not necessarily the same room. I think it's a really interesting idea. It kind of helps your cause. I like that. Okay, other questions? Yes.
Caitlin, did you give much thought to the contrast with the light at the top of the dark window?
Yeah,
Is there significance in that? in your mind?
That's a hard one because there's a lot of debate if it's coming from the inside of the room or the outside of the room. Some people say, of course, it's from the inside, but I think looking at it, it just doesn't look like it. It seems like it's like almost like a loom to me, or like something like that reflecting. And both of the images have it, which is interesting. Because there's been nothing said about it, I couldn't make a definitive like yes or no. I personally think it's from the outside, and it's kind of like a boom, and it adds to the idea that it's dark outside, and that the window shouldn't be open, and that this is kind of like a nighttime scene, and that's the dream coming in. But there's really not anything written about it previous to that. And it does make an impact on the room, I think, but yeah, I just think it's more like I think it's the mood reflecting kind of, personally.
I have a question that occurred to me, Allie, about yours. Some of this that you found is all new, interesting about the powerful women who are represented in the palace, of other things that we may not even have still the paintings left. But I went to go pick, I went to take our daughter back to her mission field in Slovenia. We went to this palace at Tui, and a woman she was actually from an English royal family, got married to somebody in Slovenia, and her palace is decorated with all these depictions of powerful women. And I'm wondering how much of this what became a tradition during this era. I was trying to think, did you run across any other women sort of commissioning works for palaces of powerful women themes, Deborah, or, from the Bible, or Esther from the Bible, or, I mean, we have all those Judas by Artemisia Gentileschi and things. I'm just wondering, did you run across any other women rulers who were commissioning powerful women depictions?
I actually didn't. I was mostly focusing on Medici and specifically Deborah Merrill in her book that talks about the art patronage of Medici. She just focuses on her specific commission. So I haven't looked at other.
And you left out your Amazon because of time, I understand. But the Amazon discussion, do you have any sense as to why you think Rubens might have painted the Amazons? What significance that might have had?
Honestly, no. What do you think?
I just think it's an interesting thing that these powerful women themes, when you just had Elizabeth, who died at the beginning of the century. Then you have Maria de' Medici, who's powerful queen during the century. I'm just wondering if it might have inspired some of these powerful women themes during the century, and if there are other examples of it.
Yeah, I imagine that Maria de' Medici, because during her exile, I didn't dive deeply into what happened when she was exiled, but she did go to England. I know that during that time, and I know that she could have been exposed to kind of these different figures in England, and maybe she saw that, I don't know, just kind of what you talked about.
Are any comparisons made between her and Elizabeth at all that we know of? Because I know it's a popular thing to do in the Netherlands. They loved Elizabeth. They thought she was great, so it might be an interesting thing.
Yeah, I'll look into that. Thank you.
Okay, other questions?
I'm sorry, I keep having questions. But I just wanted to, I have a question for Sam, but I just wanted to say, they're actually Bernini's mistress, Costanza Piccolomini, the archival, the inventory, thank you, the inventory of her homes revealed that she had very powerful women paintings in her reception room. She was from a very powerful noble family and also had been terribly maligned by a number of things in her life, and she had things like Susanna and the Elders on either side of when you walked in to see her. So I mean, I think there is, and she's the same era, a little bit later, this is when her house is inventory. But anyway, I think that's kind of interesting. Sam, you did such a wonderful job, because I saw the very, very, very first version of that paper, and you really turned that into something really quite amazing. Congratulations. I was wondering, can you tell if all those rings are rings for men? Is it possible to tell if any of them are female rings? I don't know.
I assume it's men, because I assume it's the bishops who was
right.
touching it. Obviously there weren't female bishops, but it is possible there are none of them are like, this is the Magnus ring?
It's interesting though that it's I mean, it's really interesting that that there's only the one that's an Episcopal ring. The other ones are wedding rings, all kinds of different things, because it's almost like I wonder if there's a certain significance to what ring the bishop may have chosen to put on the finger. It's really, do you know what any of the other rings are besides the posy and the signet and the Episcopal ones? Are there other ones that are identifiable?
Yes, there are others. It's primarily for like dating that makes it easier to tell. Some of them were like really early versions of like an Episcopal ring. None of them have the same kind of symbolism, but you can tell what they are.
Wow, well I thought it was so interesting, and I also wondered, when you were talking about why it maybe stopped in the mid-16th century, you said it's about, I think that was a good suggestion, maybe something to do with the Protestant Reformation, but I think another very possible suggestion is the Council of Trent, which is mid-16th century, because the Tridentine Reform really clamps down on a lot of practices that they think are superstitious or they think are outside the outside correlation, basically. And I wondered if that got caught during the correlation of Trent, potentially.
That's super interesting. I'll definitely look into it.
Yeah.
Okay, Missy, I have a question for you since I'm so ignorant, I'll admit from the outset of Japanese art. But I was wondering, because the point of your argument is really to argue that this is Zen Buddhist and not political in its, how frequently do we have panels of dragons in palaces? Is it a common thing or not?
So most of it originates from China, so in a lot of Chinese palaces of the Song and Qing dynasties, you will see dragons, but they have 5 claws, whereas in religious dragons they have 3 claws, as in Buddha and the 2 bodhisattvas that are always with him. And I don't really remember the bodhisattvas' names, but there's often that. In earlier versions, like in the Heian period and the Nara period, you can see dragons throughout palaces, but there's very few left because most of Japanese palaces were made of wood. And a lot of them were either burned or earthquakes or other natural disasters and wars.
So how do we know that? Just textual evidence?
Yeah, there's textual evidence. There's poetry done by aristocrats and like women of the harem during the time. And then also the fact that they're like dragons are also associated with like more ancient religions. Like in China, it's more of like the ancestral worship, and in Japan, it's more of the Shinto. And in Shinto shrines, you can still see dragons at the base of like a water fountain where you wash your hands, kind of thing. So they're still venerated in different religions besides Buddhism.
Was it mostly monumental painting though, panel painting, rather than manuscripts or something smaller,
During the
scroll painting?
During the 16th century, a lot of it was large panel paintings because that was considered a high and rich and mighty kind of thing. And it was usually those of the aristocratic class or a religious class like the abbot of the temple that would most likely have the money to have it. And I didn't really put an image up, but they were really large. Like from that line to that, like they were really huge. And so it was meant to be a startling statement and to be engrossed into it kind of thing. So
yeah, it really helps your thesis. Okay, yes,
My question is for Rebecca, and actually for all of the panels. Again, I echo what everyone said. It's just a remarkable work, and we're lucky to have been here today. So Rebecca, I was with you in Italy in the fall, and you had so many choices of things that you could have written on. What was it that drew you to the Lorenzetti? And for the other panels as well, the kind of work that you focused on, what was your inspiration? What drew you to those particular pieces? I'm just curious to know how you get down a certain pathway. I got to see Rebecca start one. Now I want to see how you finish
Crazy
it.
process of trying to choose one. Throughout my time in Italy, I wanted to do a materiality analysis of something. And so when we were going through the Lorenzetti exhibit that was in Siena at the time, This stood out to me because of the blatant hands everywhere. It feels as if everyone is showing their hands and wanting to touch. It feels very tactile. And that hit me as soon as I saw it, and I was led to it for that reason. The next reason I wanted to do it is because after a quick search online, I found out that that mirror was done in highly reflective silver leaf. So I went back to the exhibit and I actually got down on my knees in the middle of the gallery and I saw where my face would align with the mirror, and that was a really powerful argument for me personally.
Misty, why don't you talk about why you...
So I actually served my mission in Japan, and I grew to really love the culture and the people. And I had the opportunity last year to go to Japan for a study abroad, and they actually had a Kaiho Yusho exhibit with all of his paintings. And so I got to see it firsthand, and it was like really powerful and invoking, and I just wanted to do more research on it and found out that there's like maybe one paragraph about his life throughout every research project I've done. So I thought it was a fun challenge, and I wanted to incorporate more Eastern art along with the Western European art.
I was just flipping through books of Northern Baroque art for Martha's class to find a research paper topic, so mine wasn't, I don't know, destiny. I just came across the painting of Joan of Arc, and I just thought it was so unique because Rubens' paintings are very well known, and this one had, the date wasn't sure and it appeared unfinished, and I thought I would go for it to kind of research more into it. And actually, as I started learning about the figure of Joan of Arc, I just fell in love with this painting because she is just such an amazing woman, and I look up to her as a figure as well, and I feel like just coming to know the figure of Joan of Arc has just made me want to pursue the research of this painting even more. And I originally started out, my thesis was Rubens' painting being an early depiction of her as a symbol for France, both religiously and politically. And then it just kind of evolved into who the patron of the painting was, because it was, no one knows, and so I've just been really happy with the information that I've come across, and I honestly believe that the Medici was the patron, because just all the evidence proves it. It's been really fun.
I think I liked it just because I think there's so much mystery around Vrel and his name and who he was or who she was. And this particular image is really empty. A lot of the other images at least show tables or chairs or kids, or just this one was like unsettlingly empty, so I think kind of caught my eye for that reason, and just the mystery around his name kind of was also kind of, was always curious who the artist really was, kind of.
It was 2-3 years ago. I was in the medieval class and I was doing research on the reliquaries for my final paper, and I came across it, and I'd never seen anything like it. It's not common to put rings on it. Like, that kind of thing is super weird. And so I didn't know if it was like a real medieval thing. So I talked to Elliot, and he's like, oh, no, like this. The lady who had written about it was, she's high enough up in her field that it's like, oh, she thinks it was. And it's so weird. It was so weird, and I just couldn't kind of stay away from it.
My mom, she's here. She's from Peru, and we had the opportunity to live there for a few years. And while I was living there, the textiles just really captured me, and I wanted to know what the symbols meant. I wanted to know more about them. And with the Inca, a lot of their art was destroyed by the Spanish. And so they don't have art you can analyze. You can only look at the textiles to see their history. So that's what really captivated me towards that.
Thank you for that really great question. And with that, why don't we give a